Thank you all, and happy to be on the event. My name is Suraj, and I'm very excited to be here as part of Riverbed, offering my views on threat hunting. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen, and we can get started. Okay, so today I'll be covering a couple of topics. One is essentially about the art of threat hunting. What does it mean? And we're also going to cover a bit of ransomware and why that's kind of linked up with threat hunting as well. So let's start off by talking about what is threat hunting. Why should we bother about it? What do I need to do about threat hunting? How is that possible? And where can I find, or where can we find the time to go about doing something like threat hunting? So threat hunting is, in its definition, is the act of actually actively seeking out and disabling network intruders. So that's a very interesting definition, because a lot of people have ideas that it's actually going out and attacking the hacker, and it's not that, right? So it's not about going on the offensive. It's not about us going and attacking the hacker because the hacker attacked us. So there's also misconceptions about what it is. Is it incident response? It's not incident response either. So incident response is a situation where you've been compromised, and then you're trying to you've recognized that you've been compromised, and you're taking actions to cover up that response. And a cyber hunting is also not a 24/7 job. So it then leads up nicely to what is it, right? So cyber hunting is actually actively seeking for trouble. So it's not about alerting, it's not about monitoring systems, but it's a process in which you have to wear a special hat where you have to be curious, inquisitive, and you want to understand what exactly is going on in my network and with my applications. So why is this important? Because threat hunting deals with advanced persistent threats. So we have the definition of advanced, persistent, and threats, right? So an advanced person who's trying to compromise your network is largely an attacker who has skills. He's got a lot of time on his hands, and he selectively, they selectively have a preference to choose a particular target. So they've identified who they want to go after, and they have the skills to be able to go and do it. And they also have some motivations for going and attacking that particular organization or individual or that target, right? So this can be monetary, it can be ideological motivation that prompts them to go and attack that target. And we've seen that nation state and organized crime actors are often the chief architects of advanced persistent threats. Now, why is it called persistent? So it's called persistent because once the attacker gains a foothold into your network, they stay there. So their ability is not to launch things like ransomwares and spam the network or create things like bugs and worms and viruses, right? That's not their intention. The intention is to, once they've compromised the network, is to establish a foothold. They then want to do what is called as privilege escalation, and then move laterally. So they collect the information that they see around them, and then start laterally spreading around in the network, and then they tend to stick around for a long time. Now, what we've seen is that advanced persistent threat actors usually stay for a long time, over a year or so, on a network, and they're trying to gather information and see what amount of data or the most amount of destruction that they could cause on in that environment. So The next thing is, well, how do these people get discovered then, right? So how do APT threats get found out? The Morris worm is the earliest example of how some of these APT type threats were discovered. And it was discovered, the Morris worm in 1988 was actually discovered because of performance issues on the network. And it was the networking team, believe it or not, not the security team that actually found out where the issues were. So that's a very interesting take because the networking team actually found things that's on the network. They found signals, or they found vital signs or breadcrumbs that leading to the discovery of the Morris worm. And once again, this again comes down to the fact that when you have a problem on the network, you don't get to pick what your emergency is. You don't get to choose whether, do I need to go after Bitcoin mining? Is that something that need to be worried about, or is there, high CPU saturation? Or are these two problems actually linked together? Is the high CPU happening because there's a Bitcoin mining going on, or is there a design bottleneck with my application servers, or is this just network congestion that's actually causing it, right? So again, there's another example, link saturation. So why is that happening on my network? Is that because of routing failures? Is that because of misconfigured routers and switches on the network? Or am I actually facing a denial of service attack? Right? So that's basically what you want to know. You want to know really quickly whether you're facing an operational issue or are you facing an attack. So how do you go about doing something like cyber hunting? So what you need is a bunch of people. The most important part of cyber hunting or threat hunting is people. You need a whiteboard, some telemetry, and most importantly, a mindset for cyber hunting. The whiteboard is a very interesting way because you can actually, in these days and when everybody's working from home, you can actually have multiple ways of doing that. Message boards, you could have Trello, for example, is a great way of sharing sticky notes. So what allows, those kind of tools actually keeps the conversation interesting. It allows people to share ideas and also, exchange information about what's going on in different parts of the network. And again, the people can come from different teams. So it's not just the InfoSec team that goes after threat hunting. The network teams, the operational teams, the monitoring teams are actually great resources because they're used to looking at things like packets. They're looking at flows. They're looking at logs. They're looking at endpoints. They're looking at and examining different things, and they can bring their own perspectives into the table. So what's needed for cyber hunting is this mindset of curiosity, to have that inherent mistrust. I know there's something wrong in the network. I've seen this much traffic for computers that don't necessarily talk to each other. They're in different segments, and they shouldn't be communicating at this time of the day, right? So that's the kind of mindset where you think that the moment you see some information which is not consistent, your mistrust level goes up, right? And this is something that is a constant ongoing process. So initially, people may not have the abilities to have that inherent mistrust the ability to differentiate between what's normal and what's not normal. But that's exactly what threat hunting is, the ability to gain those kind of skills. The other things that happen or assist a lot are things like threat intelligence, anomaly detectors, or any kind of tripwires or alarms that go off when when something happens on the network, right? So these are the ingredients I would say that you can put together to formulate or create a threat hunting team in the network, right? Or in the organization. So how do you detect stuff that is unusual on your network, right? So first of all, start looking at or considering things about never before seen IP addresses or host names or domain names. And why is that host on the network? I've never seen that host on the network. That should immediately raise a red flag in your head, right? Or why is that device communicating with a destination which is outside the normal geolocation? For example, you could be located in some part of the world and you don't really do business with other parts or other parts of the world, and you're starting to see some suspicious activity from known IP addresses which are not in your region, and that's another cause for a red flag going off. The other thing attackers like to do is they like to use well-known ports and they like to hide in the open, right? A typical example of this is I'm having a lot of non-DNS traffic, but it's going over a UDP port 53, right? And that may look like normal traffic, but it could be suspicious. So those are the kind of things that should ring a bell. You may have printer traffic that's going outside of normal hours, and that might be suspicious. So why is traffic that is different or shouldn't be happening at a particular time of the day be traversing my network? So these are some unusual methods. Or then you can see new or suspicious protocols, right, or ports of communication which you haven't seen before. So those are really good methodologies for you to start your investigation by starting to look at the suspects, the unusual suspects. The other thing security teams often don't pick up is the unusual volumes of data that move in and out of the network. Flow data is a great example of tracking this information. It's largely picked up by the networking teams. So when you start to see a lot of exfiltration attacks, where you have an adversary who's on the network, they're trying to move data outside, and what flow tools can do is actually give you that information. I can give you that volume of information that's going in and out of the network. And then the other thing you want to see is if there's a lot of internal connections, or if people are trying to download a lot of data from one part of the network to another, and that's where your intuition should start kicking off. Next up, I'd like to recommend that you all go off and read something called the MITRE Defend framework. Now, the MITRE is the Defend framework is a very popular cybersecurity reference or methodology or framework that is used universally. And what we see is that this MITRE framework is divided into multiple portions: harden, detect, isolate, and so on. But what you see is that the network traffic analysis is the most biggest part of the MITRE Defend framework. So that means having a good tool which can collect information from multiple parts of your network, whether that's flows, whether that's packets, whether it's SNMP, whether it's logs, or whether it's even things like agents sending you information. And as you can see, that particular MITRE framework is quite huge, and probably you might want to go off and read that because it gives you so much information about how to proceed with the detection using network traffic analysis. Now, very often we find that, okay, if I do need to go off and do this, I may not have the time or the team or the resources to be able to go and set up threat hunting. So it can initially start off as a part-time, or it can start off as a sort of a game or a methodology that you could adopt in the organization. And then it could turn into a full-time or a full-team job if you want it to be. Okay. So again, you may have limited resources to start with, but then as you increase your skills in the specific area with threat hunting, you start to have or improve that methodology of having the skills to be able to go and troubleshoot and find active problems on your network. And then sometimes, very often, you might find that as you start your methodology or as you start your hunts, you might end up with not finding anything on the network. But these are not wasted opportunities. These are more a learning experience for you guys to be able to go out and say, well, how can I improve my hunt efficacy, or how can I improve methodologies or find new ways of uncovering what's wrong on the network, right? Okay, so what are some fun things to get started? So a few things is you could start with a hypothesis-based investigation where you could, sort of assume that there's a part of your network which is hacked or compromised, so there's a threat actor on the network, and you could go after that hypothesis. Another methodology could be you look at events, you look at internet news, and you decide that, okay, there's been a attack on a specific organization, or a particular flavor or type of attack on that's popular in this month. How would that possibly attack or attack us, or how would that affect us, right? So you look at the news, then you find out there's an attack, and then we start to formulate and look if that specific attack is relevant for our organization, right? Or you look at some of your traffic and say, well, does that traffic actually make sense, right? Or is that router supposed to be doing that, or is that application traffic supposed to be doing that, right? So that's the does that make sense game. And then the last two are you look at specific interesting applications that you could just say, well, I got 25 applications on my network. Well, let's pick an application and see if that application actually has any specific vulnerabilities or things that we can go after and have a look. You could also look at connection attempts, and you could say, well, what's the most busiest application on my network, and how many users are making those connection attempts, and why should I go after these specific connection attempts? Because it looks like there could be a pattern of connections that you might find interesting, and you might get started with that, right? So here are some different approaches of how you could approach threat hunting. Okay, so with a hypothesis-based investigation, so here are some examples. So you could start off with a hypothesis with saying that, what if I told you your CEO's laptop was compromised? Then how would your teams react? How would your threat hunting begin for that specific scenario? Or how would you react if your conference room TV was part of a zombie attack in which it participated in a DDoS storm? Then how would you prove me wrong, right? So you formulate the hypotheses, and then you would investigate them, right? What part of that, where's the CEO's laptop connected? What network is he on? What's his IP address? What's his MAC address? What's running on his computer, right? So that's what's important, and that gives you that methodology to get go in that route. With the in-news investigation, so you put together a weekly reading list. You look at articles. A couple of them are really good here. US CERT, ARS Technica. These are some really good information. Not only do they provide you the threat or the attacker of the day or month, but they also give you some very good information about how do you go and fix that problem or fix that vulnerability, right? And then you want to see if that actually applies to your network, or does it apply to your environment. With the does that make sense game, so this is more for the operational folks. So if you have a monitoring team, you have people looking at dashboards, you're looking at networking information, you want to be able to train your brain to look at information and say, well, does that make sense? Where does this information look wrong? For example, on that chart, if you look at the web traffic is a significant part of your network. But then there's also BitTorrent, which is your second biggest traffic on the network. And then that should be an automatic alarm bell going off saying, why is there so much BitTorrent traffic on the network? And then you want to build a correlation saying, well, what are my most busiest locations, right? And Hartford, is that a big site for me? If it's not a very big site, why is there so much traffic on the network? There's not even users on that site at this time of the day. So those are the alarm bells that need to go off when you start looking at charts. And you can start from this sort of mechanism to play that threat hunting game. Next up, application analysis. So attackers often use standard protocols, right? Ports like 8080 or 443, or they look at, administrative traffic even. So they can blend in with administrative traffic because they're typically used for control. They're used for management purposes. And some of these are SSH, remote desktop, SNMP, or TeamViewer, right? These are very popular channels for attackers to blend in with that kind of traffic. So you might want to go and have a look at that specific kind of traffic and analyze it and try to understand if there's something dodgy that you don't, you think that you need to investigate further. Attackers also like to blend in with protocol traffic. So SQL 1433 or server message block for file sharing. So again, these are very popular mechanisms because they are useful for exfiltration of data. You want to be able to see if your attackers are stealing information from, say, a database, or are they stealing information from file shares that's on the network. And again, correlated with the time of the day, the locations, the network devices involved. So again, picking an application and seeing what the application is about is another mechanism, is another threat hunting mechanism. Connection attempts. Connection attempts are all about who's knocking on my doors, who's trying to do things, port scans, ping sweeps, brute force attacks. Am I subjected to these? Are users trying to log into my websites and they're trying different passwords, or they're using credential stuffing, or they're trying to load, a file full of different credentials that's been compromised. And you can buy these credentials or the usernames and passwords on the dark web, and they're running scripts to break into your websites or applications. That's another mechanism that you want to look at. You want to be able to look at tools which can give you connection attempt analysis, or you want to look at endpoints that don't exist at all, like or you look at unallocated IP space. And these are again very good examples of threat hunting initiations, right? That you could begin. So what you're going to learn from this is the ins and outs of your network. You're going to start thinking about what looks normal, what does not look normal, who's on the network, when are they on the network, and what are they doing, what applications are actually running on your network, and are these applications supposed to be talking to other hosts or outside the network? Is that suspicious based on time of the day, and so on and so forth. You also want to look at if these applications have any hidden services, or they have dependencies, or are they downloading updates from the internet, and where's the location of that update server. And if that update server is actually poisoned, and its updates are actually compromised, then how would you figure that out, right? So this is where the threat hunting process allows you to discover what normal looks like. And once you know what normal looks like, you will also have the ability to recognize what's not normal, or rather abnormal. So a quick conclusion. So if you have the right tools, you also have to spend a bit of time. And if you have the talent, threat hunting can be a complex task, but the basic information is very simple. And when it pays off very big, right? So with this, I'm also going to cover one more topic, and that's about ransomware. And ransomware is another important topic, which is in the news because it's the number one threat that we hear about in the news today. It's across multiple industries. There's a lot of people who pay ransoms for their software being compromised, and this is a growing problem, right? So here are some examples. Colonial Pipeline, the attackers had charged a lot of money from the users, from the customers, and it's bleeding money, right? So at the end of the day, you get compromised, and you're ending up paying a substantial amount of money to the attackers. So how does ransomware actually happen, right? So typically what happens is the files on the compromised host or your server or storage or wherever, they get encrypted. And this encryption happens by using what is called asymmetric encryption. And that's typically what the attack vector methodology that attackers use for ransomware attacks. So what ends up happening is the ransomware itself gets shipped out to the victim, and it has a key, has a key number A, which is used to encrypt that attacker's or the victim's endpoint or device. And once the device is locked, so the victim has no other choice but to pay money to the hacker, and the hacker in return may provide a key number B, and key number B is how you use to decrypt that information, right? Now, this image is typically what happens when you get compromised, right? So you start to see your files. You don't see your files, in fact, you see these weird extensions, and you have an instruction.html, which describes pretty much what you have to do. You got to read that file, which tells you how to unlock your locked up device, or you end up re-imaging the device and not having to pay the attacker. But what if your files are really important and you need to get them? Or what if your data is really critical to you and you absolutely need that information, right? So typically what happens is, in order to encrypt information, an attacker has to gain access. He has and that could be because of vulnerabilities on your network. It could be because of bad passwords. It could be because of email attachments. It could be because of applications, or it could even be USB sticks, which are a very popular way of inserting ransomware into somebody's machine, right? Ransomware can also be payload on worms and viruses. So the moment the user clicks on a worm or a virus that they open in an attachment, then the ransomware program kicks in, and you get compromised. So a couple of these were very famous. You have the WannaCry one and the Petya, and both of these were examples of ransomware which propagated through crypto worms. So how do you get out of this? So without having to pay the ransoms? Well, one of the ways that you can try mechanisms is the No More Ransom project. It's an open source community which has a list of master keys, and it also publishes flaws in certain ransomware, certain popular ransomware, and also has information on decryptors and key brute forces. So maybe this is your first point or port of call. So maybe you want to actually look at the nomoransom.org and try to find ways in which you could sort of brute force your locked device and see if you could recover your device somehow without having to pay the ransom, right? So this would be an avenue where you could have teams look at information like this and try to if you have the time and if you have the actual energy to go about doing this, you could. The other option, and most companies or most organizations tend to do this, is to pay the ransom, or they try to recover the data from a backup that they previously got, or they just get on with their life, they re-image their computers, or they start using other devices completely, right? Now, we've seen that the hacker evolution has also changed, right? So what we've seen is that ransomware is largely operated by humans, right? And in order to extract the most amount of ransom, you need to ensure that the victim is out of all options, right? So there's no point in encrypting a user's machine when you very well know that the user can recover the machine in no time. So in order to disrupt that user completely, what you'll need to do is you need to ensure that you knock off all kinds of viable backups and alternatives, and make that or paralyze the victim completely, so that the only way that the person can recover and get back into normal operations is by paying. And you can see there are a lot of big payments made, over the past couple of years, and you've seen that these are not trivial amounts. The large millions of dollars invested in just paying out ransoms or to attackers. However, in order for an attacker to actually infiltrate the network, it takes time. It's not something that happens overnight. And ransomware, it can also manifest itself as a advanced persistent threat, right? So a user may have to control, or an attacker may have to control all relevant assets. Maybe they need control of the servers or the databases. They'll need to know what data is critical to that specific customers. They'll need to know what endpoints are critical to that customer. They'll need to know where the backups are located and destroy them, right? So while the attacker is on the network and trying to destabilize the environment, it takes time and effort. And it takes time to get the foothold, the assets to be recovered, the lateral movement, and the privilege escalation. What we've also seen is that ransomware is now offered as a service. So you've got the creator of a ransomware who offers ransomware to middlemen. The middlemen are the attackers, and the attackers buy the ransomware from the creator of the ransomware, and then they choose specific targets or victims to go after and infect ransomware programs on those devices, on those victim devices. And it's a very lucrative market, because what happens is the attacker gets money from the victim, and the person who wrote the ransomware or the ransomware author takes a cut of the proceeds, right? So this is a very interesting way. It's a very lucrative thing that that we're seeing out there. So here's a screenshot of how a typical ransomware as a service dashboard would look like. And once a victim is compromised, he goes over to the dashboard, makes his payment in Bitcoin or whatever currency that that the attackers are demanding, and he gets his decryption key, and the attackers move on to the next target, right? So how do we prepare for all of this? So let's recognize that while the attacker is out there on your network, they're actually vulnerable during this time, which is called as a dwell period. Once they gain access to a particular environment, they'll start to want to move laterally, and they'll want to discover assets. They'll try to do brute force attacks. So while this process is happening, you've got to have tools which force the attacker into the open, right? So you might want to have things like EDR tools, 2FA tools, or firewalls that can force the attacker in the open. Once the attacker is out in the open, you can analyze the telemetry, right? So attackers can't hide from network telemetry, because they might be using programs, and those programs will be communicating with other devices. And by capturing packets, by capturing flows, by capturing telemetry from different angles, you can actually investigate that traffic and perform analysis on it. So what you'll need at this point is to have your runbooks ready to say that, okay, in case I have a ransomware, what should I do? What are the steps that I should do to take action? Should I be looking at my backups? Should I be doing offline backups? Should I be doing recovery procedures? So these are the things that you might need to be responsive to. Use the network as a battleground. This is another great way in which you can prepare and battle against cyber threats. The network is your terrain. It's your place, and you know that very well. The adversary doesn't probably know your network very well. So again, force the attacker on to your network. Implement tools in which you can change the terrain. For example, network segmentation is something that you would absolutely do. Separate management network versus user network versus IoT network versus printer networks, for example. You could do that. You could use VPCs, you could use firewalls, you could use two-factor authentication. These are all mechanisms which actually force the attacker into the open. These tools also increase the dwell time, which means that the attacker has to spend a lot more effort in trying to break through all of these defenses, and this forces attackers out in the open. So um, with that, I'd just like to leave you guys with some parting thoughts on cyber hunting as well as ransomware. So cyber hunting is the act of actively seeking out and disabling skilled and dangerous intruders, right? So how can you protect against this? So an active search for trouble is accomplished by collecting telemetry from different networks and endpoints. Uh, this telemetry can be packet data, it can be flow data, can be endpoint telemetry data. So when you combine the data that's coming from your networks with the security tools that you have, you get this really rich ecosystem using which you can find information that we wouldn't have access to before. And again, telemetry is very different from alerting. So alerting is something that, that if you have a router that goes down, or there's a device that is stopped communicating, it'll give you an SNMP message saying, the device is up or down, or it's not doing so well. But on the other hand, telemetry is about information that you can gather about your network. For example, what's the amount of data that's flowing on my network? Who's talking to who? IP addresses, DNS information, host names. So these are all very rich sources of information. You want to be able to store it, and you want to be able to go back in time and see what happened on a Tuesday last week at 9 p.m. And you want to see the traffic between location A and location B and what they were doing. So what we do at Riverbed is have solutions which can actively participate in cyber hunting and cyber threat hunting. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening to me.